What I want to do today is share a little bit of brainstorming we've been doing off and on as a conservation committee of the Trumpeter Swans Society over the last few months, looking at strategic priorities for trumpeter swan conservation. My co-authors are basically the conservation committee shown there, and Tiffany Mayo, who chairs our education committee, was also part of this effort. So why are we doing this? We're doing it because things have changed. Our last crack at a strategic plan was about 2015, and that focused mostly on internal society business, continuing to support the restoration work that now has largely been so successful, and supporting research here and there. And while restoration work remains vital in some places, certainly the U.S. Intermountain region is one that jumps out at you. A lot of things have changed. The places, the conservation landscape for swans is different. The birds are dispersing, land use continues to change, humans affect the environment, and it might be that factors affecting trumpeter swan demography are not quite the same as they were 10, 20 years ago. And so we wanted to take a kick at this. We've divided the major elements we see as important into three main categories: population status and demography, habitat needs, quality and quantity, and telling the swan story to our stakeholders. We view these as pretty much of equal weight. They're just different. A couple of them deal with biological issues. The last one, obviously, with social information needs and communication efforts. So in May, knowing this conference was going to be held this fall, or at least hoping it would be held this fall, we decided to circulate our draft of conservation priorities to some folks who we thought could provide some really useful input. And it went to 40 some odd people. And we got feedback from many of you, several of you who are in the room. We thank you for doing that. So what we're going to do today is not talk just about what the board kind of agreed to a year ago, but each of the next half a dozen slides are going to look like this, where we sort of at the top describe the topic. At this level, talk about some of the recommendations that were in our strategic draft that we pulled together. And then under that, mostly in italics, helpful suggestions that we got from our reviewers. So hopefully you'll see some of your own thoughts reflected in the next few slides. All right, population status and demography. We know that the Continental Survey has been put on pause. Perhaps it's gone. We don't know that. But for each trumpeter population or subpopulation, certainly we would like to see consistency, sustainable resourcing, and improvements in some cases in those surveys so that we can track population segments, spatial and temporal trends, and so on. So what did we hear back? The first thing we heard was that, yeah, okay, but really, the first thing you need to do is step back and really assess how any monitoring data that we're going to collect in the future is going to be used. How is that information going to help inform conservation decisions? You know, fair ball. There really isn't a lot of point collecting data if there's no clear plan for it to help inform decision-making. That will require that we have current objectives for these populations or subpopulations, and that we've made some progress in understanding those conservation decisions that most need new data to help inform those decisions. And so the final point that a lot of people made, and we acknowledge this, is that this is going to vary among population segments. We're not all the same. We're not all at the same stage. And so maybe a continent-wide estimate of overall numbers is not the highest priority anymore. Maybe it's a more segmented kind of thing. We also felt that supporting the better demographic analyses were important. Key information on recruitment and survival, for example, might be really important to help us understand what's going on. And people by and large agreed with that, recognizing that some sort of indices of productivity and survival might be really helpful. But we also had people suggest that simulation modeling using a reasonable guess at a range of demographic parameters, vital rates, might be pretty informative too in helping us just think about the kinds of issues that may be affecting populations. And so we've included that as well. We had relegated the issues of lead poisoning and power line collisions to kind of a secondary level of priorities in our initial draft. And that was mostly because looking at the overall trend in populations, we weren't convinced that it was really limiting trumpeter populations overall. But several people pointed out that this still is a really significant source of mortality in some places. And there's probably research needs here and perhaps some remediation work still required to help reduce these sources of mortality. And then finally, if there were to be an expansion of general swan hunting in North America or parts of North America, clearly that raises the bar in terms of what we need to know about trumpeter swan population levels and about both and their movements around connectivity between wintering and breeding areas and population dynamics. Certainly a higher bar than is currently in place when these birds are not being exploited. I must say too that this week has reminded me about how far ahead most of you European investigators are with understanding things about population trends and through all your marked bird work and so on, really feeling quite envious about that and hope that over time we can begin to approach what you all now have in terms of your understanding of the demography of these birds. Habitat quality and quantity. We asked the question, what might existing data tell us about contemporary swan habitat associations and movements and requirements? I must say, I'm very excited by all this GPS data that are being collected right now, because if we can dig into that at a finer spatial scale and start to understand more about how birds actually use these habitats and where they're clustering and how that relates to land use and crops and natural wetlands and so on, that might be really helpful to us in beginning to think more explicitly about future conservation actions. The issues that are coming up around crop depredation too, I think require more fine-grained analysis. And we're going to have that if we're going to build good carrying capacity models to help address potential additional conservation, habitat conservation work in the future. I spent a lot of my career working with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and the joint ventures. And I think that's a whole level of partnership that we need to be much more focused on trying to link up with, because they have a lot of knowledge about how to build carrying capacity models and with the combination of the joint ventures and the federal refuges and the state wildlife areas, I think those can be really helpful partners in looking ahead and projecting what future habitat needs might be as these populations continue to grow, or as they just spread out and go into new habitat where they haven't been before. So telling the swan story, we still think it's vital to engage stakeholders and the general public in Swans. There's a great opportunity to celebrate the wonderful successes that have been achieved, but at the same time, remind people that there are still things to be concerned about looking ahead, and as the birds expand and new areas, more of them, and some residual problems in key places like the Intermountain West. So we went through a pretty standard kind of thought process here about, okay, what do people currently think? What specific goals do we have for engaging people? Who are the key target audiences and the associated messages, and so on. And people said, yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, that's what you should be doing. But what do you really want in the end? And so we heard from a number of people that we really need to be thinking about what we want the results of a long-term conservation efforts of trumpeter swans to be. What does success look like? And that's a fair ball kind of challenge for the society, but it's a challenge for all of us to think about as we revise and update management plans for these birds. What do we really want to see at some distant time in terms of the birds and their distribution and their security and so on. So a challenging question. And then secondly, make sure that you assess anything you do in your communication and marketing efforts to make sure that the programs adapt and that you're getting good return on your investment in communication as you go along. Don't just assume that all these things you can think about might be working. Well, I don't have to spend much time talking about this because Dave Hoffman spent most of his talk explaining what these opportunities about using swans as ambassadors for wetland conservation might do. I really think this is potentially very important. I mean, we're at a point now where there's a growing interest in non-game wildlife viewing. In the US in particular, it looks like there's significant money on the horizon to help support more and more work on non-game birds. The trumpeters are spreading geographically. They're going into new areas. There's more of them. It just seems like the opportunity is really there to look to try and see what we can accomplish for wetland conservation for people and other wildlife, wetland conservation broadly on the back of the trumpeter swans. So I think that's something worth thinking about and trying to gear up to do. But we can only do these things together. Implementing all these ideas is going to take money, it's going to take staff, it's going to take time, it's going to take partnerships, a lot of coordination, and certainly Trumpeter Swan Society is not going to do all this. So partnerships are key. I decided not to try to list them all because there's dozens, but of course the states, the provinces, the federal governments who have management authority for these birds. I think the habitat joint ventures, the universities who provide science support, we can help provide them with a little bit of money. The continuing restoration efforts, the zoos have been terribly important in helping us do that. And increasingly important in education initiatives where the zoos have an enormous opportunity to kind of pull people into the whole swan story. So partnerships clearly are key to helping create a better future for these birds. So where are we? We initiated that peer review process this summer, and we're going to take what you've told us, of which I just gave you a small snapshot here today, and do a second draft of our thoughts on strategic priorities for swan conservation. And then we have to expand that to a broader strategic plan for the society, which starts to deal with how we're going to resource all this. You know, how are we going to create the capacity in terms of people and time and money to get to play up some role in helping to get this thing done. Importantly, we have just getting underway a revision of the implementation plan for the management plan for the mid-continent population. But we had a very productive first meeting on Tuesday night here with the states, provinces, feds, and a few other folks. And I think there's a game plan in place now for moving that effort ahead over the next several months. So stay tuned. I think there's going to be some pretty exciting progress made in revising that implementation plan that is, or that management plan that is now some couple of decades old. All right. So that's what's on the horizon. Thank you for listening. We still really would value your feedback. On the abstract are the email addresses of myself and Margaret and all the other people on the Conservation Committee. We'd love to hear from you. And certainly we'll share a second draft when we get that completed, hopefully in the not distant future. Because this has to be something that, we're thinking about what this means for us as a society, but clearly it's a broader effort than that, and we hope we can contribute to thinking about how the changing status of the swans also might mean some change in how we focus our efforts in the years ahead. Thank you.